We are very excited to announce a new free ICSA webinar series on SMGA recovery. This series is specifically for second and multi-generational adult former cult members. However, this is going to be the first program for SMGAs that is open to all. In the past, ICSA workshops for this population have been limited to those who were themselves born or raised in cults. But we see the increasing need for mental health professionals, educators, academics, researchers, and others to understand the vast needs of second and multi-generational adult former cult members in their journeys in recovery. My name is Ashlyn Hilliard, and I work for the International Cultic Studies Association. I am now very excited to introduce our next session in the SMGA recovery series on sexual issues of SGAs and MGAs, presented by Donna Whitsett and Katarina Meredith. Donna Whitsett PhD, LCSW, MFT, is a Fulbright Scholar and a clinical professor emerita at the USC Suzanne Dork Peck School of Social Work, where she taught courses focused on neurobiology, trauma, mental health, and sexuality. As a psychotherapist in private practice, she has been working with cult-involved clients and their families for over 25 years. She is also AASECT certified as a sex therapist. Her specialties of cultic studies and sexuality often overlap due to the exploitation of human sexuality by high-demand abusive groups. Dr. Whitsett has presented to professional audiences both nationally and internationally in Australia, Canada, France, Poland, and Spain. Her research activities include women's sexuality in China, sexual dysfunction in the military, and sexual issues of SGAs and MGAs. Her latest publications include chapters on a modern psychodynamic approach to working with first-generation cult survivors and global violence of women in cults. Katarina Meredith is currently working towards a PhD in community psychology, studying the psychology of extremism and terrorism. Her research interests include intergroup and intragroup violence, right-wing extremism, online extremist propaganda, and radicalization, group processes, exit, and identity. She is a published author with a focus on outreach and education and the executive director of Stronger Actor. From age 10 to age 20, she grew up in a small New Age cult where she was separated from her parents, cut off from the outside world, and taken to 3 different countries and asked to build a time machine. The time machine never worked. She lives in Atlanta with her husband, 2 children, 2 cats, her therapy pug, and a fish. Her hobbies include eating, traveling, foraging for mushrooms, and reading fantasy novels. Thank you so much, you two, for presenting today. Because this is a particularly triggering topic of discussion matter, we ask that you take care of yourselves in whatever way needed. If you need to step away from the computer at any point, please do so, and please talk to yourself. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. As Ashlyn said, I'm going to be presenting with Katarina Meredith on sexual issues of SMGAs. I'll be presenting the first half, and Katarina will do the second half of the presentation. Okay. We are all products of our environment, of the explicit and implicit messages we receive from our families and our communities. If we come from a sex-positive culture, where messages about sexuality are about sexual pleasure and reaching our sexual potential, then our sexuality will develop to be a source of joy. If, however, the culture is sex negative, filled with restrictions, fear-based messages, or surrounded by shame and humiliation, or where our sexual innocence is stolen, sexuality is distorted and can be a source of pain. Being born and raised in a cult, in a destructive cult, is such an environment. SMGAs grew up in a milieu where their sexuality, like everything else, was profoundly influenced by the cult leadership, and conforming to the rules was coerced through humiliation and shaming. In the Bible-based groups, for example, with their patriarchal structure, women are given constant messages that they're second-class citizens, and they learn that their function is to serve and support the male members, and in some cases, to breed. And in the case of child abuse, children learn that they aren't loved for who they are, but for what they can provide in the way of sexual gratification. And these characteristics have implications then for sexual functioning. In such an environment, what is meant by healthy sexuality can be unclear because there were no former models of healthy sexuality for comparison for SMGAs. This is one of the differences between the first and subsequent generations, that there was no prior knowledge. So what is healthy sexuality? It is a positive attitude towards sexual activity, which is seen as inherently healthy and good, and a vital form of self-expression by oneself or between consenting partners. And these ideas then come from healthy role models and from good education. So to begin, we need to better understand the sexual issues of SMGAs in their context. And so we're going to look at where they come from. The sexual context of cults means that there are particular factors in a cult that influence a person's sexuality. And since sex is a powerful aspect of our humanity, it is very threatening and can be very threatening to the cult leader or leadership. Therefore, cults try to control many, if not all, aspects of sexuality. At one end of the continuum are the groups such as the Bible-based groups into which preach abstinence until marriage, who suppress sexual expression. And at the other end of the continuum are the New Age groups, in which people are encouraged to indulge in sexual activity with other members indiscriminately. But either way, the model is not freely chosen. It's really designed and designated by the leader. And that can change at his or her whim. For example, David Berg, the leader of the Children of God, suddenly instituted the practice of flirty fishing when he claimed to have had a vision one night. And then women were expected to go out and recruit by prostituting themselves to recruit members. Therefore, individual members in such groups do not have agency over their bodies, and the depth of intimacy and attachment that sex would normally bring to a couple is very much weakened. Other aspects of sexual behavior, such as childbearing and child rearing, are also controlled. Can a member have children? Are they prohibited from having children? How many children are they expected to have? Normal development is derailed, privileging the cult prototype. That is, all aspects of an individual's personality are molded to this cult ideal, including then sexuality. For example, in some groups, boys and girls are kept separate and are punished even if they talk to one another. These early forays into sexual relational experiences are important for socio-emotional development, and SMGAs are deprived of those. Adult attachments are also discouraged or sabotaged as they threaten the leader's control. There's often a very sexualized atmosphere in cults as well. Adults may be changing partners quite frequently. In some groups, people walk around nude, and this is considered normal. In a few groups I've heard about, the bedroom and bathroom doors are removed. And of course, this is a very concrete way of breaking down that boundaries. Cults are contextualized by isms. And perhaps the most significant consequence of the patriarchal model upon which most destructive cults are based is the damage to girls' identity. Identity includes self-esteem, self-worth, self-confidence. And when women see themselves as inferior to men, they can't be a full partner in a sexual relationship, heterosexual or same-sex. Therefore, in recovery, women need to develop a voice to be able to express their sexual needs to their partner. Obviously, well, in most cults, one of the isms, of course is heterosexism, and homophobia runs rampant. There is a role that attachment plays in sexuality as well. The attachment system shapes the sexual system. The quality of early attachment to mother is the blueprint for subsequent relationships. And it's been found that a secure attachment predicts later secure relationships. Research also shows that securely attached people enjoy sex more and are more adventurous in their sexual lives. The quality of attachment, unfortunately, in most SMGAs that we see, at least in clinical practice, is the insecure type, due to partly the enormous pressures on the biological parents and the fact that children are often sent to other countries or other parts of the United States or North America for training, for school, and for missions. This is a beautiful and extremely sad depiction of what happens often to the mother-child bond in cults. And this is designed by Katarina Meredith, who's a brilliant artist, and she is going to discuss this later on. Unfortunately, there are many sexual issues of SMGAs. Due to my time limit, though, I've had to pick out the 5 that I think are arguably the most important. Perhaps the most significant one is feeling entitled to be sexual and to have sexual pleasure. This is not unique to SMGAs, but is probably more exacerbated in this population. There is what's called the orgasm gap in heterosexual relationships. And I think you can guess what that is, where men almost always have an orgasm during each encounter, but that is not the case for women. I don't have time to go into that. Although we could discuss that later on. A major contributing factor that women in general have is that they focus on their partner's pleasure to the extent of their own. They don't ask for what they want. They're often embarrassed to ask, are particularly afraid of being shamed by the partner, and often don't know what turns them on. If this is true for women in the general population, which it is, how much more pronounced would it be among SMGAs who grew up having their emotional needs ignored and having to put others' needs first? To know what you want, though, and what you need in sexual relations is you have to know your body, to self-pleasure. And just a little quirk of mine, I prefer the term self-pleasure to masturbation, which always sounds very technical and not attractive at all. But self-pleasuring can bring up feelings of shame because of the prohibitions from the cult. Arousal itself, sexual arousal, can act as a trigger, especially if you have experienced sexual abuse. So I put feeling entitled as the #1 issue of SMGAs. Lack of knowledge is also due to sex education in America, at least, which focuses on the biology of men and women to the exclusion, really, of the sexual pleasure system. Particularly in women, most sex education does not deal with the clitoris, the area known as the G-spot, the various types of orgasms that women are capable of, and how to achieve them. Unfortunately, sexual issues can result in sexual dysfunctions, which interfere with sexual pleasure. In the general population, low sex desire was found to be the most common sexual dysfunction. There are many reasons for that, but for our purposes, I want to mention a study by Rosemary Basson, who found that one of the most important factors contributing to low desire was that women felt degraded, disrespected, and devalued. And so again, if this is true in the general population, I think you can see how prevalent it must be in the SMGA population, where those feelings are quite ubiquitous. Paradoxically, though, some studies have shown that child sexual abuse early in life primes the body for early sexual desire as it increases testosterone levels, and testosterone is the hormone that underlies desire. So that in these women, they may actually have higher sex drive, which is an interesting contradiction. Another major reason for low desire is not wanting to experience pleasure. If you grew up with messages that sex is bad, dangerous, the devil's temptations, then feeling sexual will be associated with shame, and it's easy to clamp down then on pleasurable feelings. And Wendy Maltz reframes sexual dysfunctions as protections against re-experiencing past trauma. In terms of orgasmic issues, first of all, there has to be a sufficient level of arousal for orgasm to occur. And again, the intrusive thoughts, fantasies, and memories will result in people clamping down or tempering, shutting down their sexual arousal. Guilt and shame, #2. There is a difference between guilt and shame, although they're often used interchangeably. Guilt is about breaking the rules, while shame is about who one is, who breaks the rules, your essence. Now, toxic shame is the projected shame from the cult leader, as Dan Shaw reminds us. It's a feeling of self-loathing and feeling utterly unlovable. Now, sexuality, even in mainstream, is shrouded in shame, excuse me, especially for women. In fact, the old Latin term pudendum is used for the vulva, which translates to shame limb. Number 3, triggers, intrusive thoughts, and dissociation. During traumatic experiences, the memory system gets corrupted. Some of the pieces of the event don't get integrated into the whole. The emotion is there, but the context is missing. When and where it happened. These unintegrated pieces then act as triggers, resulting in hyperarousal, the fight or flight response, or the freeze response, dissociation. In other words, you experience the present as if it were the past. Now, it's fairly common for sexual abuse survivors to get triggered during sex. It doesn't have to be full-blown panic attacks. It could be unwanted thoughts, memories, or sexual fantasies can intrude as well. And some of these thoughts dampen down the sexual arousal, but paradoxically, some of them are stimulating. The stimulating ones are the ones that cause guilt and shame for having them. But these are the ones, but these are quite normal, even though they are distressing. And Wendy Maltz, who I've mentioned before, found that 4 out of 5 sexual abuse survivors were troubled by sexual fantasies. So you can see it is quite common. When people are afraid of getting triggered, of course, they shut down their arousal, depriving themselves of sexual pleasure. So to minimize triggers, there are a number of things we can do, but for this talk, I will just mention using your critical thinking. Do I want to have sex right now? Do I want to have sex with this person? Do I really want to be doing what I'm doing? Do I want to be, how do I feel during this experience, and how do I feel afterwards? Do I feel respected by this person? And am I seeking love and affection through sex rather than sex through love and affection? Number 4, boundaries. Being raised in a cult means being part of the collective, the Borg, if you know the Star Trek reference. Children don't have a chance to develop their own boundaries, to know that their body belongs to them, especially if they've been sexually abused. Living arrangements are often conducive to abuse, such as if there's a lack of generational boundaries that would protect children, such as in the polygamous cults where girls marry their uncles and cousins and, you know, all of that. So one of the recovery issues, of course, is for people to learn to have a voice in sexual relationships, to feel entitled to say no regarding sexual activity. One boundary issue is giving consent, and consent fries are a good way to remember this. It's freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific, and prior consent doesn't mean current consent. Number 5, intimacy. When people leave groups, they may go through a delayed adolescent period of normal sexual experimentation and hypersexuality. This might be especially true of the LGBTQ members, because not only was their sexuality suppressed, but they were shamed for who they are. Due to the lack of practice that typically occurs in adolescence and young adulthood, when social skills are developing, former members often struggle with forming relationships. They don't have practice. Lack of trust and an early insecure attachment style compounds these intimacy difficulties. One phenomenon I'd like to mention, so we can be aware of this, is that people born and raised in cults will often act out the dyadic relationship of the cult leader-follower dynamic, because that's really all they know for the most part. So in a couple, one may identify with the leader, becoming emotionally abusive and controlling, and the other takes the role of follower and is subservient. And some people incorporate the power dynamics of the group into their sexual repertoire as well. And it becomes part of their love map, if you will. The love mat is what we find hot, which develops in childhood. And it's not uncommon for survivors to be attracted to BDSM practices. As one survivor told me in a very, very insightful way, when you put discipline and humiliation and love and affection all together throughout your formative years, it can become part of your sexual preferences. That being said, we have to be careful not to make too much of this association because we don't have a comparison sample among the general population to compare SMGAs with the general population. It turns out that based on the largest survey of sexual fantasies in America, conducted by Dr. Justin Lehmiller, in a book called Tell Me What You Want, which I highly recommend, that the second most popular sexual fantasy was BDSM, rivaling multiple partner sex fantasies for the #1 spot. So to end, I'd like to end with this. Don't let your past define you. Ask yourselves, who am I? Who do I want to be? What do I want my relationship be to my body, to my sexuality? Do I want to deprive myself of a source of joy, fun, pleasure, or am I going to allow myself to have this very vital source of life, of life energy? So don't let the past rob you of a past, of a present and a future. In a subsequent talk, I hope to be able to talk about the coping mechanisms and the strategies for dealing with all of these sexual issues. But for now, we will take questions and Katarina will be speaking. Thank you for your attention.